everybody. Thank you. On behalf of President Schiller, who had an external commitment today and couldn't be here, and the Thomas More University community, I welcome you to Monsignor Gerald Twaddell's inaugural lecture at the Wilbert L and Hackman Ziegler Endowed Chair in Philosophy. First of all, what a pleasure it is to inaugurate the Endowed Chair, our first at Thomas More University. I used to know a university president at Seton Hall who would sometimes invite me to breakfast at the seminary, which was always a treat. And then after breakfast, he would walk me out into the little garden outside that the seminarians enjoyed, and he would point to this big oak tree, and he would say to me, "It takes vision to plant a tree." The person who planted the tree is no longer there, but the shade was enjoyed by so many. It's a vision for the future of Thomas More that propelled Wilbert and Ellen Ziegler to establish their first endowed chair here, and so aptly for us, I think, as a Catholic university in the discipline of philosophy. Thank you both for your visionary attention to academic prominence. Monsignor Twaddell's talk is titled Pondering Patriotism, and as Professor Langdon noted in his message to the community earlier this morning, he explores the conceptual muddles to which we are sometimes prone when we claim that someone or some act is not patriotic. The topic could not be more timely at this particular time, and regionally and nationally, right? One of the muddles that attends to patriotism is, of course, the related concept of jingoism. In an attempt at cheeky intervention, which I try often with Monsignor Twaddell, when he told me about his focus today, a little while ago, I joshed him by saying that I could think of one or two circumstances where jingoism might be just fine as a practice. And because I see almost all of life through the lens of cricket, I elaborated by noting Lord Tibbet's declaration in the House of Lords in Britain in 1990, when he argued that all British Indians, British Pakistanis, British West Indians, and British Sri Lankans who root for their home country's cricket team when the latter are playing in England in the summer, should be sent back to their home countries. I suspect that Monsignor Twaddell may well engage today with patriotism in all its dimensions, and its underside as well, the practice and lore of Jingoism to which we all sometimes succumb. Welcome and enjoy this rich lecture that will take us on an intellectual journey through many minds, ultimately to Plato and then to Aquinas. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Molly and I did not compare notes, so some of my comments are a bit repetitive, but I'll spare you my cricket thoughts. Good evening. My name is Kevin Reynolds. I have the honor to serve as the Vice President for Institutional Advancement. I wanted to be here to welcome you to the inaugural event of what will be an annual lecture from the Wilbert L. and Ellen Hackman Ziegler Endowed Chair of Philosophy. On behalf of Thomas More University and President Chillo, I want to take a quick moment at the beginning of this event just to say a profound thank you to Will and Ellen for their wonderful support and for being such inspiring examples of Thomas More graduates living out our mission as pillars of generosity in this community and to their alma mater. As we spend this year beginning our second century, we are very proud to call you both alumni, and we are grateful for all that you have done and continue to do for the more than 2,000 students and more than 16,000 graduates of Villa Madonna College, Thomas More College, and now Thomas More University. You all are truly a blessing for our community. Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and I hope you enjoy Pondering Patriotism. Dr. Kate Sharon.
Good evening. I'm Dr. Catherine Sharon, and my primary role on campus is to teach philosophy. I also fulfill the role of Administrative Department Chair of Philosophy and Political Science, not as much fun as it sounds. At the start of every class, I ask, what is going on in the world that's relevant to our course? Current events prompt my students and I to connect them to our course material as we puzzle out how to make sense of our place in the world and our responsibility to others. For example, in my global ethics course just this semester, we've discussed, should Americans support the International Criminal Court's pursuit of justice for crimes against humanity in Syria? And what is the philosophical basis for such international laws? What should I do to improve the plight of the most displaced refugees in the world? What is the significance that you can now, for the first time, fly direct from Bahrain to Israel? What is the nature, if any, of the United States' obligation to Ukraine? What about to the Ukrainian people? These questions ask us to think slowly, to break apart arguments, to get clarity on terms, evidence, positions, thinkers, and theories. The job of my philosophy colleagues, Monsignor Twaddell, Dr. Lange, and our adjunct faculty, Dr. Parker and Dr. Jones, is to examine ideas, to consider what exists, what we ought to do, what we can know. Paradoxically, such examination is both a luxury, one needs sufficient time to ponder, as well as a necessity. Ideas can build up as well as tear down a civilization. We are so fortunate at Thomas More University to have a thriving philosophy program where students take 2 philosophy courses to graduate, thereby given time to examine some of the world's most important ideas. And our fortune does not stop there. As we are tonight realizing the generous gift from the Zieglers, an embodiment of the value of philosophy in the form of the Endowed Chair and its financial commitment. Monsignor Gerald could not be more deserving of this honor. His Endowed Chair will help support our students' education in philosophy, which in turn contributes to the flourishing of our communities well into the future. Monsignor Twaddell has been a philosopher for longer than many of us have been alive. You notice that he is also a priest, but you may not know that as a young man, his aspirations leaned towards psychiatry. In fact, he's devoted his life to serving others and searching for truth. Fluent in French, English, Latin, and Greek, extraordinarily well-read, not just in philosophy, but in modern history and politics, in literature and music, Gerald Twaddell is our real-life man for all seasons. In tonight's talk, Pondering Patriotism. No worries, it's going to be in English. Monsignor Twaddell is walking us through the components of what patriotism has meant and could mean. Monsignor Twaddell will ask us to think carefully about the words of thinkers who have pondered this family of terms: patriotism, loyalty, piety, love. In his argument, we will hear echoes from the heart of the hymn, "This Is My Song," also known as the Finlandian Song, composed by Jingoism, words by Stone and Harkness. My country skies are bluer than the ocean, and sunlight beams on clover and pine. But other lands have sunlight too, and clover, and skies are everywhere as blue as mine. Oh, hear my song, O God of all the nations, a song of peace for their land and for mine. Just as the hymn recognizes love of land and country can be both local or expansive, Monsignor Twaddell's goal is to expand and enrich the concept of patriotism in service of a country, a world in which, ideally, philosophically, all may flourish. It is my great pleasure now to welcome my friend, colleague, and priest, the Reverend Monsignor Gerald Twaddell, to give the inaugural address as the first Wilbert L. and Ellen Hackman Ziegler Endowed Chair in Philosophy.
I also want to turn on the microphone. I also wanted to add my thanks to the Zieglers for their great generosity in establishing this chair. It speaks to their own devotion to the truth, to the finding of the truth, and the special role that philosophy has in that area. I just quickly say that this is a very long talk. I cut it down as much as I could. And there are passages that I've decided to leave out. However, later on during the question and answer period, we have a commemorative booklet that has the entire text in it. I'm sure everybody is going to want to go home and read that again before they go to sleep tonight. And if they need help going to sleep, they can do just that. There are also, as I say, there are going to be a question and answer period, and someone will distribute little cards for anybody who wants to write up a question for me. I do have questions already from some of our philosophy majors who had an advanced copy of the unfinished version of the paper. And so I will begin by answering their questions and then take any others that come to me. You have the roadmap, which I hope will help you keep from getting entirely lost. But it will also be, at some point as you turn the page, you realize, oh my gosh, there's this much more. So we'll do this. So in these times, hardly a day goes by without some claim that someone or some act is or is not patriotic. Depending on the interests or attitudes of the claimant, the term may be confused with or at least have overtones of any of several different ideas. Sometimes the confusion is with chauvinism, an unreasoning, boastful fervor for one's country, one's race, one's sex, especially male, often combined with contempt for all others. At other times, the confusion is with jingoism, as Dr. Smith mentioned, which takes chauvinism to a higher level by advocating aggressive, threatening, warlike foreign policies. Often enough, patriotism is mistaken for militarism, which advocates the maintenance of a strong military control of a country, and increasingly it is confounded with some form of nationalism position which subordinates the totality of a nation's needs and concerns to all-encompassing national interests, especially economic ones, even to the detriment of the people, often embracing isolationist stances on international issues. Nationalism also often includes a strong dose of militarism. There may be reasons why such muddles occur that need to be explored. This lecture will attempt to sort out some of the misunderstandings and perhaps offer a pathway to a more nuanced view of patriotism, rooted in a pre-modern understanding of human relationships. To put this view in a succinct phrase and offer a clue to where we're heading, I want to suggest that patriotism begins at home. This past year, Yale University Press published a very timely book by Stephen B. Smith, professor of philosophy, and Alfred Coles, professor of political science at Yale University. Entitled Reclaiming Patriotism in an Age of Extremes, the work seeks to rescue patriotism from the political exaggerations that menace contemporary life in the United States of America. The author advances a vision of what he styles an enlightened patriotism, freed of chauvinist, jingoist, and nationalist interpretations, while responding to the complaints against patriotism of those of cosmopolitan persuasion, as well as far left-wing critics. Already in the introduction to his essay, Smith offers a brief statement of his position. Patriotism, in the most rudimentary sense, is a form of loyalty to one's own, to one's people, one's community, but especially to one's constitution or political regime. Patriotism is far older than nationalism, but it is also more endangered and subject to abuse. Smith's work offers a good starting point to gather some ideas and issues that we will want to explore further. One of the most valuable features of Professor Smith's work is the attention he devotes to the historical understandings of the concept of patriotism. In Chapter 3, he undertakes an explication of ancient and modern conceptions. That is important to the project of rescuing patriotism from misrepresentations. Indeed, his point about patriotism being much older than nationalism hinges on the simple fact that the nation-state is an invention of the post-Reformation modern era, and the idea of nationalism arose even later in the context of European Romantic movements. While the historical information provided is certainly valuable, the discussion of ancient ideas concentrates almost exclusively on the Spartan culture. Athenian views are barely hinted at, nor are Roman discussions such as that of Cicero. Other than a passing mention of early Christian concerns in the form of criticisms leveled by modern authors against the place given to the final heavenly homeland over the earthly city, Smith regards its influence mainly in bolstering a Stoic universalism that would later give rise to cosmopolitanism. The discussion of modern thought is much more robust, and the place of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his admiration for the Spartans seems to account for the emphasis found in Smith's presentation of ancient thought. There's no attention, however, to any medieval thought at all. In his section on patriotism for the modern age, Smith systematically presents the thoughts of Montesquieu, Adam Smith, and the Federalist authors. The first, Montesquieu, the originator of the language of modern liberalism, concentrated his attention on the nature of republics rooted in virtue, which he envisioned as animated by love of homeland and love of equality. The strong self-sacrifice and austere self-renunciation demanded by this form of government required a serious program of education. Nonetheless, Montesquieu held that the age of republics has passed. The virtues of the ancient world were to be replaced by a new ethic of humanity, with a capital H, inaugurated by the rise of modern commerce. Adam Smith, best known for his 1776 publication, The Wealth of Nations, offered a lengthy discussion of patriotism in his other great, though much less widely known work, The Theory of Moral Sentiment. His position there is that patriotism is a natural sentiment of benevolence or gratitude. He warned against a sort of national prejudice, leading them to distinguish a savage from a humane form of patriotism, the latter being the liberal expression of a more enlarged and enlightened mind, who felt no aversion to the prosperity even of an old enemy. In Stephen Smith's analysis, Adam Smith proposed a pair of contrasting types of legislators, one relying on a rigid spirit system, which tends to lead to tyranny, the other aspiring to an authentic patriotism rooted in sentiments of humanity and benevolence. Moving on to discuss what he terms the Madisonian Moment, Stephen Smith presents James Madison's contribution to the elaboration of the argument for a new Enlightenment-inspired extended Republican form of government meant to quell the sorts of agitation that marked the representative republics of the ancient world, trusting in an approach which would exclude factions in the form of groups united by interests that would be at odds with the rights of fellow citizens or the interests of the community as a whole. Madison sought to turn politics away from the warrior ethic of triumphant glory that had been espoused by the Spartans and their imitators to the management of competing interests, thereby eliminating fanaticism and zealotry. Even so, Madison thought that the best way to minimize the deleterious effects of faction would lie in multiplying them rather than wasting any effort in attempting to stamp them out. Citizens would have only an indirect voice in government of Madison's design, choosing representatives in all the branches. Smith notes that the result of these arrangements means that Republican patriotism would be best exemplified in the people's choice of representatives. Still, for the Federalist authors to assure that the Constitution would be venerated by the people, the representative bodies would need to have sufficient stability among office holders to give weight to their actions. Something more than reason alone was necessary then, namely a sort of civic faith, or as Smith points out, what Abraham Lincoln would later call the political religion of the nation, resulting in a sort of political theology. It would be a patriotism, therefore, grounded in both reason and civic constitutional faith, not a traditional religious faith. These sons of the Enlightenment may well have despised obscurantism and superstition which they saw in traditional Judeo-Christian religions, but they perceived and respected the force of a quasi-religious sentiment that would undergird common interests in the face of factional divides. At this point, we may step back a moment to gain a clearer idea of why Smith undertakes the historical overview that he offers. In an earlier chapter entitled Patriotism and Its Critics, he laid out the objections raised by many of those who see patriotism as a vice rather than a virtue. A variety of literary authors, from George Bernard Shaw and Leo Tolstoy to E.M. Forster and Graham Greene, are on that list. In the philosophical world, George Chatham of Princeton University rejects patriotism as incompatible with Enlightenment ideals, particularly its opposition to all forms of groupthink. Similarly, Martha Nussbaum of the University of Chicago would invoke ancient Stoicism in support of a cosmopolitan citizenship, regarding patriotism as a form of paternalism. Smith, on the other hand, finds her conception difficult to square with our sense of moral duties to individual human beings. To counterbalance these opponents, Smith considers the somewhat tentative position of Alistair McIntyre, who, in a lecture delivered at the University of Kansas in 1984, treated patriotism as a form of loyalty central to a group of virtues respecting social belonging. McIntyre, though, also acknowledged the tension that arises from the demands of post-Renaissance thought, which stresses the ideal of the unbiased spectator in moral matters, which would lead to granting an exemption from criticism for some characteristics of one's community. The large nation-states invented in the modern era can hardly escape this tension. Smith, however, faults McIntyre for attacking all liberalism as though there were no distinction between that of Locke and J.S. Mill on the one hand, and that of a later view that sought to produce a distinctive canon of liberal virtues that characterize a particular kind of moral community, what might be called a bourgeois society. That's a quote from Smith. McIntyre's error was to misinterpret Hegel's distinction between Sittlichkeit and Moralität, as well as the meaning of patriotism, according to Smith, who wants to take inspiration from Hegel's notion of Bildung, or moral education, in line with his own view of enlightened patriotism. Smith makes a point of referencing a remark that Hegel includes in the philosophy of right regarding the tendency of many to equate patriotism only with a willingness to make extreme sacrifices for the nation, yet with a disregard for ordinary daily civic duties. This is a point that may well be worth exploring in a later lecture. The section of Chapter 2, titled English-Speaking Patriotism, offers a helpful overview of the entry of the vocabulary of patriotism into the English language in 16th century Great Britain and its evolution through the following 3 centuries. At the origin, patriotism was set over against the tyranny of the crown by authors who saw England as an ideal republic of virtue, economic equality, frugality, and political liberty. We should remark that the term decidedly did not mean loyalty to the king or his government. Quite the contrary, a patriot was someone willing to die for the country at the hands of the king. The Commonwealthmen yearned for a return to the ancient British constitutional republic they believed had been usurped by royal rule. The 18th century saw the rise of modern political parties in England, the Whigs and Tories. The former dedicated to a sort of oligarchic rule protecting the rights of Englishmen, their liberty, and a parliamentary system of government, the latter supporting the ancient constitution of the state and the hierarchy of the Church of England. It was the Glorious Revolution that gave rise to the more modern view of patriotism expressed by the 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury, an admirer of John Locke, as identifying love of country with dedication to a free constitution rather than to the land. Shaftesbury was not, however, without his critics who distrusted his position as opening a way for a new form of tyranny. As a result, patriots came to be seen as hypocrites who merely pretended devotion to their country. The term patriot was restored to a positive connotation by Henry St. John, Viscount Bolingbroke, in a 1736 essay on the spirit of patriotism, wherein he asserted that a patriot was one who would support national over particular interests, who would act without regard for party allegiance. Ideally, the king would be a patriot of this sort, who, while recognizing that parties are a source of dissension, would be clever enough to use them to the advantage of the state. As the 18th century transitioned into the 19th, in America, these ideas would evolve in a new context and with a new direction. While John Adams favored the balanced government of the British, Jefferson and others saw the Lockean philosophy of rights as the basis for a new constitutional government. In this setting, patriotism would need to be recast to fit a different system. The Federalists used the old terms, such as republic, while assigning them a new meaning, undreamt by the ancient Greeks and Romans, to solve problems that the ancients had not been able to overcome. Hence, as Smith puts it, the specifically American form of patriotism required a unique combination of particularism, loyalty to the Constitution and the Republic, and universalism, that is, commitment to equality and rights. How to square the circle? Circles, of course, cannot be squared, and therein lies the puzzle of patriotism in our day, as much as in the time of the Federalists. Stephen Smith offers his enlightened patriotism as an attempt to resolve the puzzle. Let us briefly look at the final chapter of his book to discover just what Smith means by that phrase. An initial claim that Smith makes is that what distinguishes American patriotism from that of Germany or Japan is that America is a creedal nation based on an idea. It is not sufficient in America to express loyalty to a tradition or to the fatherland. One must be loyal to the set of ideas on which our traditions are based. In our country, theory and practice have been mixed together from the beginning. American patriotism, like America itself, is exceptional. Ours is not an ethnic patriotism born of fantasies of blood and soil, but a patriotism of ideas. Note immediately that the assumption that patriotism is a form of loyalty is a primary consideration. Second, that loyalty to blood and soil, the rallying cry of Hitler's Nazism, is excluded in favor of a loyalty to ideas, which, as it turns out, are drawn from Enlightenment philosophy, that all men are created equal and possess rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At the same time, there is an inherent tension because these ideals are said to hold true for all humans at all times and places. The second theme that Smith takes up is that of a constitutional regime which differs from other forms of government in two ways. First, such a regime requires a written document setting forth the rights and powers of the government in relation to its citizens. A constitution of this kind provides the basis for all other laws. Secondly, a constitutional regime separates the function of the state from that of society. As a consequence, the fostering of virtue, unlike in the view of Plato or Aristotle, nor will not be a duty of the state, but rather of society at large. Hence, if patriotism be regarded as a virtue, the responsibility for its promotion will not fall on the state, but on civic structures. Smith mentions civil associations, schools, and service academies as likely candidates for nurturing virtue from below. A question might be asked at this point, however, is since schools and service academies are extensions of the state, and perhaps civil associations are at least authorized by the state, how would these not simply be carrying out the function of instruction in virtue or on behalf of the state after all? In such a case, the state would not truly have divested itself of those functions, but merely obscured its activity by interposing apparently independent, but still state-sanctioned or perhaps even state-sponsored institutions. In any case, Smith moves on to examine Abraham Lincoln's patriotism of principle. Lincoln's vision is described as egalitarian, aspirational, and inclusive. The first of these traits, egalitarianism, Lincoln would put ahead of democracy as a condition for the very establishment of a democratic society. As for the aspirational element, Lincoln viewed the American ideal as one committed to individual self-development and perfection, thereby making patriotism resolutely individualist, in the manner of Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. At the same time, Lincoln was enamored of the notion of progress, which for him was always a matter of fits and starts, trial and error, rather than a guaranteed continuous upward path. It is in this sense that Lincoln's patriotism remains aspirational. The third trait, inclusivity, meant that Lincoln refused to see America tied to any specific religion, race, or ethnic identity. His position placed him in opposition to the nativist and anti-immigrant positions of the American Party or the Know-Nothings. As Smith explains, Lincoln welcomed those of recent ancestry to the table. What makes a citizen is not direct genealogical descent from that race of iron men, but adherence to the principle for which they contended, the principle of equality, the father of all moral principle, in the which is the electric cord that unites all liberty-loving men. In a section of the chapter devoted to patriotism as ethos, Smith delves into a nest of conflicting notions. He begins by asserting that care and loyalty are of a piece. Loyalty is an affirmation of what we care about, and our cares are not momentary whims or desires, but a structure of loyalties. These cares define who we are or wish to be. To sharpen the meaning of patriotism that Smith is advancing, he introduces contrasting concepts, those of obligation and fidelity, relying on an article by Judith Sklar entitled Obligation, Loyalty, Exile. Obligation points to a form of authority found in large-scale, rule-governed bureaucracies like corporations, and of course modern governments, themselves driven by a notion that they must be run like a business. Fidelity, on the other hand, is a private relation to particular individuals. Smith cites Sklar's assertion that loyalty, rather than being a rational engagement, is deeply affective, reaching deeper than obligation and having a wider reach than fidelity. This, in her view, makes loyalty a commitment of a whole personality. Against this backdrop, Smith points out a possible confusion that some might have about his idea of constitutional loyalty to a liberal democracy. He claims that while one could imagine a fascist or a communist America, these would not be able to call forth the kind of constitutional loyalty that characterizes the America intended by its founders. Likewise, he wants to distance his position from the constitutional patriotism of Jürgen Habermas, designed to counter the hyper-nationalism of the Third Reich by orienting people rather to the basic law enacted by the Federal Republic of Germany. This form of patriotism would be disengaged from the ideals of blood and soil and linked instead to rights and legal procedures. The weakness that Smith perceives in that approach is the lack of the affective connotations of pride, service, and loyalty that bind together members of a nation and make them citizens. He goes on to say a few things that I'm going to skip. He says, it's a kind of patriotism that only a constitutional lawyer could love. By ethos, Smith intends a manner of both thinking and feeling. Such an ethos defines a settled manner of behavior of a whole community, whether small or large. Since an ethos sets forth what is normative, what ideals people admire, patriotism will require not only an understanding and appreciation for a set of abstract ideas, but also their embodiment in a particular history and tradition. Logos and ethos, principle and habit, are two sides of the same coin. Both are essential elements of an enlightened patriotism. Smith readily acknowledges that there can be objections raised to his form of patriotism. The most obvious one is that loyalty to one's country seems to imply that the commitment to equality and inclusiveness characteristic of American patriotism must be abandoned, effectively denying that citizens of other countries are actually equal to Americans and thus ought not to be included in a realm of rights of all humanity. Smith insists, however, that there's no need to renounce concern for the needs of others. It isn't like team loyalty, but more like family loyalty, which doesn't justify despising other families. Another danger that Smith acknowledges is the notion that ethos patriotism leads to disregarding the weaknesses and failings of one's own country. Again, Smith wants to claim that patriotism not only can but ought to be self-critical. This is because he believes that pride and shame are the two sides of loyalty, and patriotism is inconceivable without them. It emerges in a following section of the chapter that the root of this conviction lies in something suggested by Edmund Burke about public affections, which grow first from the family to the neighborhood, then outward in expanding circles of inclusion, even to embrace all of humanity. The conclusion that Smith draws is that patriotism is a form of love, and that loyalty is something like gratitude. In this matter, he's close to the view of Adam Smith, whom we'll revisit in due time. Further issues need to be addressed involving conflicting loyalties, such as those of friends and family, to country, and to religious principles. The difficulties arise because people do, in fact, have multiple loyalties. One might not be able to act in loyalty to one friend without being disloyal to another. Similarly, one may not be able to honor one's loyalty to family and to country without conflict, and so on. Smith points out that such choices are not simply about what to do, but what rule to follow. But also about what sort of person one wishes to be, what sort of character one wants to have. The most striking kind of conflict would pit one's loyalty to country against one's loyalty to one's religious faith. But for Smith, The kind of constitutional faith that grounds American patriotism can, maybe should, perfectly well be placed ahead of one's religious beliefs. An additional concern lies in the area of outright resistance to wrongful action on the part of one's country. Can patriotism make room for such opposition? Smith notes Socrates' rejection of his friend Crito's desire to help him flee Athens to escape the death sentence handed down against him. So that the kind of American patriotism that Stephen B. Smith wants to reclaim from the threat of various nationalisms around the planet will not be about prideful self-assertion or imposing a litmus test. Rather, it will retain the self-questioning trait that has prevailed since the founding of the Republic. The commitment to equal moral dignity of every human being, a commitment to the rule of law that offers a sense of fairness and prevents the abuse of power. Unlike the ancient republics, it will make a clear distinction between the public and private spheres that will ban their tutelary despotism in the name of limited government. It will preserve the values of pluralism and respect for diversity. We differ not only in race, but also in religion, political perspective, physical and athletic prowess, age and experience, intellectual excellence, moral capacity, geography, and culture. The list goes on. A heady call for inclusiveness against a backdrop of increasing isolation in the silos of so-called social media. But in the succeeding pages, Smith makes a plea for overcoming contentious debates about culture that pit those who believe liberal democracy created an anti-culture of mass deception against those who would see a world of mass standardization and uniformity needing to be replaced by a retreat into small, rural, patriarchal communities. Instead, Smith insists that our cultural life testifies to a vibrancy of civil society and the wisdom of allowing art, music, literature, and science to develop autonomously outside the scope of political supervision. Likewise, he calls for acceptance of a kind of economic development and opportunity promoted by capitalist democracy, noting the coincidental publication within months of each other of the Declaration of Independence and Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. That the tenor of the latter would belie his claims that the market is only a single limited means for generating wealth and distribution of goods and services, or that capitalism needs to be tempered by concerns for economic fairness and social justice, or his claim that capitalism has downsides, he does not attempt to offer an account. In a similar vein, Smith extols the individualism injected into the American psyche already at the arrival of the Pilgrims, even while admitting that it can erode our capacities for civic life. He is optimistic that those dangers can be tempered by other elements of the national creed that stress faith, service, and loyalty. Meanwhile, Smith points out a uniquely American sort of faith and hope, bound up in its patriotism that recall a religious sense, but in the American context, very different from the hope and faith of a believing Christian or Jew or Muslim. Faith and hope in America are not based on divine promises. And lastly, he tells us that American patriotism is exceptional, not in the sense of a triumphalist assertion that America is somehow better than all other nations. That is to say, the exceptionalism that many would claim provides a blank check to export democracy, to rule other countries, or to convert them to our way of life. All that Smith has to say sounds so uplifting, so reassuring, so hopeful for an exit from the painful divisiveness of recent times that one might wonder that there could be any concern. However, there are some issues that surely need to be addressed. These begin in the very framing of the meaning of patriotism as a form of loyalty. Smith, of course, is not alone in taking this position, but as he himself pointed out, the concept of patriotism is ancient. But the idea of loyalty is a feudal invention, and as noted earlier, Smith leaves the Dark Ages out of his account in favor of the Age of Enlightenment. Moreover, the ancient phrase in Latin was amor patriae, love of the fatherland. And as we've seen, Smith viewed devotion to soil as an unsuitable association for patriotism, an aberration of Nazi ideology, though German Romanticism had embraced the value of blood and soil a century earlier. Yet Smith accepts the notion that love and gratitude are involved in patriotism, though perhaps not for the same reason as earlier thinkers might have proposed. So again, how does loyalty become central to the discussion of patriotism? Certainly, the history of the term patriotism laid out in the Oxford English Dictionary never uses loyalty, following instead the usage of 18th century writers who mention public-spiritedness, for example. More to the point, the OED derives the meaning of patriotism from that of the patriot, one who disinterestedly or self-sacrificingly exerts himself to promote the well-being of his country, one whose ruling passion is the love of his country, one who maintains and defends his country's freedom or rights. One of the citations it offers is drawn from Bishop George Berkeley's 1724 essay, Patriotism, section 24. A patriot is one who heartily wisheth the public prosperity and doth also study and endeavor to promote it. In the background of this whole question, we find that one of the authors whose work Smith engages is that of Alistair MacIntyre. As noted earlier, Smith had some disagreement with the 1984 conference, Is Patriotism a Virtue? But one point he did not contest was MacIntyre's introduction of attitudes of loyalty into the discussion. MacIntyre points out a central problem with patriotism is that the particularity of the relationship is essential and ineliminable. From the point of view of a modern impersonal ethic of impartiality, that would identify patriotism by definition as a vice. Liberal thought, whether it's Kantianism, utilitarianism, or contrarianism, requires that any moral principle apply equally to every person similarly situated at all times and places. Any form of partisanship or partiality violates that requirement. On MacIntyre's own, very different account of morality, though, the community to which one belongs and in the traditions in which one learns one's moral principles and precepts is crucial for the understanding of both the content and the nature of moral commitment. So that what I learn as a guide to my actions and as a standard for evaluating them is never morality as such, but always the highly specific morality of some highly specific social order. Furthermore, the goods a person pursues are found within that community of beliefs and principles. Each member of the community is a moral agent precisely because all are moral agents, sharing fundamental moral perceptions. Herein lies the basis for MacIntyre's conclusion that detached from my community, I will be apt to lose my hold upon all genuine standards of judgment. Loyalty to that community, to the hierarchy of particular kinship, particular local community, and particular natural community is on this view a prerequisite for morality. So patriotism and those loyalties cognate to it are not just virtues, but central virtues. The rational justification for considering patriotism as a virtue lies in the notion that the morality of the community produces and constitutes at least partially a form of shared social life whose goods are directly enjoyed by those inhabiting the particular communities whose social life is of that kind. Liberal morality, by contrast, requires the agent to assume an abstract and artificial stance, that of a rational being as such, responding to the requirements of morality not qua parent or farmer or quarterback, but qua rational agent who has abstracted him or herself from all social particularity. In effect, a citizen of nowhere. And he doesn't mean utopia. The complaint that the liberal moralists would raise is that the loyalty of such patriotism would have to be unconditional and so would require the patriot to disregard any false feelings or outright evils produced by the society to which he or she belongs. McIntyre's reply is that the patriot is to be loyal to the project that brought the distinctive community into being. This does not commit the patriot to give blind consent to evils, which rather undermine or even destroy the nature of that project. Thus, there is nothing inconsistent in a patriot's being deeply opposed to his country's contemporary rulers if he sees them leading it to perdition. Of course, another person might look at the same facts and see not a path to perdition, but a highway to heaven, precisely because they do not, and perhaps never did, comprehend the original project of the founders of the community. McIntyre is willing, by the way, to consider the possibility of a community whose project, that is, its common good, generates an impartial form of moral life, though he nevertheless finds the Enlightenment liberal morality to be a threat to true community life in which patriotism is a virtue and not a vice. Let me move on now to Adam Smith. Stepping back in time to the period of the founding of the American Republic, we must observe that Adam Smith, whose ideas we encountered earlier, does not frame his discussion of patriotism in the theory of moral sentiments in terms of loyalty. Rather, he describes the conditions by which nature recommends to us the state or sovereignty in which we have been born and educated. In part, our affections for that state relate to the fact that those closest to us are in the same state, and so their prosperity and safety depend in some measure upon its prosperity and safety. It is therefore endeared to us not only by all our selfish, but by all our private, benevolent affections. That's a citation. We take pride when it appears superior in comparison with other societies, and mortified when it appears inferior. The partiality that we feel toward it seems entirely justified, so that the patriot who lays down his life for the safety or even the vainglory of the society appears to act with the most exact propriety. In this context, a traitor is understood to be one who places his own benefit above that of his native country. And this, too, is not framed in terms of loyalty versus disloyalty. Instead, Smith speaks of affections. Similarly, a few lines further along, he points up another difficulty as he declares, "The love of our own nation often disposes us to view with the most malignant jealousy and envy the prosperity and aggrandizement of any other neighboring nation. Absent any expectation of just treatment by their neighbors' nations, each nation foresees or imagines it foresees its subjugation in the increasing power and aggrandizement of any of its neighbors, and the mean principle of national prejudice is often founded upon the noble one of the love of our own country." It was this point that introduced that contrast between Cato the Elder and Scipio Nausicaa that Stephen Smith referenced earlier. For Adam Smith, the prosperity, the internal happiness, the agricultural or industrial growth of another nation ought to be emulated, not envied. It is the jealousy and envy that Adam Smith finds distasteful. The question that needs to be explored is the source of that love of country. Adam Smith rejects the possibility that it might arise from the love of humanity in general, precisely because jealousies and envies would be inconsistent were that the case. He advances the idea that we do not love our country merely as a part of the great society of mankind. We love it for our own sake and independently of any such consideration. The reason underlying this, he suggests, is that the wisdom which contrived the system of human affections saw that the best way to advance the interest of humanity was to have each individual attend to a particular portion of it. Adam Smith, in a world that had not yet seen the explosion of instantaneous worldwide communication and global economic condition, thought that only nations in close proximity, such as England and France, would experience national prejudice and hatred. So love of one's country would not encourage enmity towards people on the other side of the globe. Even when statesmen promote out of public benevolence alliances among nations, they do so principally, he says, from the interests of their own nations, rather than the advancement of more universal concerns. Even the love of country faces destabilizing forces from the attachments that individuals have to particular powers, privileges, and immunities that various orders within a society may enjoy, and the state supports such divisions. In a longer passage, Adam Smith tries to capture the meaning of love for country. The attitudes and affections that love motivates also lead to the active promotion of the welfare of all. So long as a country is peaceful, the support of the government will effect those desirable outcomes, but in case of discontent, the varying understandings of what advances the public welfare can be so deeply divided that a patriot may not see how best to choose between reestablishing the authority of a contested system on the one hand, and on the other, adopting a new arrangement entirely. Either foreign wars or civil factions can lead to such conflicts. Partisanship can arise in either circumstance and can be exacerbated by what Smith calls a spirit of system, mixed with an idealistic public spirit founded upon the love of humanity, upon a real fellow feeling with the inconveniences and distresses to which some of our fellow citizens may be exposed. A fanatical attachment to such notions will be difficult for leaders to overcome, but it will be necessary for them to restore tranquility and order. In any case, the leader must religiously observe what by Cicero is justly called the divine maxim of Plato, never to use violence to his country, no more than to his parents. Neither force nor a purist insistence on the total implementation of a supposedly perfect system in the face of opposition will serve the country well. That sort of arrogance is not compatible with love of country. Smith's discussion of patriotism shows that he views it not as a form of loyalty, but of love for one's country that promotes by all means available the well-being of all one's fellow citizens. Self-centeredness, partisanship, and an ideological determination to impose an imagined perfect system all militate against patriotism. I'm going to leave Adam Smith there. The next section is concerned with the concept of loyalty. I'm just going to basically cite what it says on the little handout there, that we're reminded that the ideal of loyalty originated in the Middle Ages to describe the legal basis of the oath of fealty taken between a vassal and his lord. In more recent times, the definition has become much more vague. The American philosopher Josiah Royce, often forgotten, in an attempt to make it more precise, ends up calling it the will to manifest as far as possible the eternal, a sense of transcendence. That is not the notion of loyalty that you find in much of today's discussion, especially in the business world. So let me go on to talk about Cicero. Adam Smith referenced Cicero, suggesting that we might find additional insight into the nature of love of country in his writings. The topic and its related issues are addressed in several of his works. The De Officiis, which is a comprehensive manual in ethics that Cicero wrote for his son, who at the time was studying in Athens. The De Re Publica, a sort of manifesto calling for a return to the system of government that had preceded the tyranny of Julius Caesar. The De Legibus, a dialogue imitating Plato's late work, The Laws, were written to promote a system of laws suitable for a republic. A number of texts in De Republica explain a general understanding of life and society, and these provide a good point of entry into his thought. I am not, however, going to go into all of them in detail. The important thing is that the social impulse for Cicero is something that lies at the very root of human nature, in contrast with the modern, especially Anglo-American emphasis on individualism arising from the Lockean social contract theory. The immediate implications for living as a social being concern caring for family and others that one holds dear. Additionally, Cicero claims in section 7 of book number 1 that the most important principle which binds people together in society is that of justice, whose first task is to ensure that one person not do any harm to another, and secondly, to provide that a person use common goods for the benefit of the community and one's own goods for oneself. He makes the following observation. But since, as Plato has very clearly written, we are not born for ourselves alone, but the land of our birth claims a share from us, friends another share, and as the Stoics hold, whatever is produced on the earth is created for the use of all people, as people too are born for the sake of the people, so that they may mutually be of assistance to each other. We ought to follow nature in this, using the common goods as means of exchanging services, giving and receiving by our skills, our works and talents, to bind human society among people. Section 16 makes the point that this will be accomplished when kindness is shown to each person in proportion to the degree of our relationships. Such degrees are found among all members of the human race, as well as all who share reason and language. He clarifies, too, that there are closer ties between those who belong to the same people, tribe, or language, the citizens of the same city-state. But for Cicero's strong bonds of family, relatives, and friends, the ones that link people to their country, is strongest. Parents are dear, children are dear, so are relatives, friends. But all the loves of all are embraced by one fatherland, for which anyone who is good would not hesitate to die if that would serve its good. In De Legibus, Cicero approaches the question of diverse ties from a different angle. In the second book, he takes his friends in the dialogue, Atticus and Quintus, to one of his favorite spots, his birthplace. He tells them, this, and this is important, this is the fatherland of me and my brother, for we were born here from a very ancient stock. Here are the rights, here the race, here the most ancient traces of our elders. Since Cicero identifies this place as his fatherland, Atticus inquires, have you then two fatherlands? Or is there just one common fatherland? Unless perhaps you think that the wise Cato's fatherland was not Rome, but Tusculum. Cicero's reply is especially interesting because he replies without hesitation, by Mercury, I consider that both he and the inhabitants of all the Italian towns have two fatherlands, one by nature, another by citizenship, just as Cato, since he was born in Tusculum and received citizenship in the Roman people, so too those of your Attica, before Theseus ordered them all to emigrate from the farms to the city. So we are joined with that fatherland where we are born, and that other by which we were chosen. But necessarily, the latter stands first in our love, in which the name Republic means the citizenship of us all, for which we ought to die, to which we dedicate our entire selves, and on which to lay down, and as it were consecrate, all our goods. There's a footnote pointing to a famous text that you might hear echoes of that in the American founding documents. Cicero stresses the true importance of the love for the fatherland by employing the word caritate, not simply amore, in the phrase necesse est caritate eam restare, thereby drawing the reader's attention to the preeminent place patriotism has in life, as well as the central feature in it, love rather than fides, which might be translated loyalty. He further insists that the fatherland of his birth is only a little less dear to him than the one of his adoption, and for that very reason, he can never deny how much and tenderly he cares for it. To fill out this sketch of Cicero's thoughts on love of country, we turn to the De Republica. In Book 1, Chapter 2, he notes that all the principles of laws that the philosophers have enunciated were already discovered by those who drew up codes of law. So he sees the foundations for laws being laid by the fathers, the ancestors, those very people who passed down the patria, the land itself, as an inheritance. In the 4th chapter of Book 1, writing in reference to the sufferings which he personally had to endure because of the service he had rendered to his country, Cicero takes a very strong position on the claim that the patria has on her children. Our fatherland did not lawfully give us birth and educate us so that she would not expect some sort of nourishment from us, and serving to such a degree our convenience that she did not supply a safe refuge for our leisure and a tranquil place for our rest, but so that she might appropriate the best and greatest of our courage, genius, and counsel, and leave just as much to us for our private use as might remain. Cicero is clearly ready to allow that to happen. He sees it as simply what is due the patria that gave him birth. His sentiment is so similar to that expressed by Socrates in Plato's dialogue, the Crito, that it was from that text that Cicero surely got the idea, and that connection needs to be followed up. So now something about Plato and the death of Socrates. The text that Cicero alluded to above is found in Plato's Crito, a dialogue which is part of a series concerning the trial of Socrates as well as the time leading up to his execution. There's one more dialogue, the Euthyphro, whose setting is on the day of the trial as Socrates is arriving at the court. It contains an interesting exchange which sets the stage for the apology, since it explores the problem of one of the charges against him, namely impiety. When this discussion is connected with the others, one can perceive that the heart of the matter for Plato is precisely piety, that virtue which is said to be the greatest of all virtues. Briefly, Socrates meets a young man, Euthyphro, a self-proclaimed expert in matters divine, a sort of theologian, self-made, who is coming to the court to file charges against his own father for murder. He tells Socrates that his family and many others are angry with him because they think it is impious of him to lodge such a complaint against his father. Keep that in mind, I'll be coming back to it. Who, in any case, did not actually kill the laborer, who was the one who had committed murder, but did not attend to him after binding him and leaving him in a ditch while he went to get direction from the authorities on what to do next. Socrates asks Euthyphro to explain to him just what piety is, and in due course, what holy means. Euthyphro offers what he is doing, charging his father with murder, as an example of what piety means. Socrates is not surprisingly dissatisfied with such a reply about a particular act, and presses further, asking whether something is pious because the gods say it is. In other words, the divine decree is what makes something pious or holy, or rather, whether the gods call it pious because they recognize it as simply intrinsically pious. That is, in and of itself, it has that characteristic. The dialogue comes to an abrupt end when Euthyphro, frustrated that he can't convince Socrates that for all practical purposes, whatever Euthyphro himself calls pious or holy simply is what he declares, and he rushes off. Without the expert teaching of Euthyphro to use in his defense, Socrates is left to go on to his trial. In Apology, Socrates tells how Miletus has charged him with corrupting the youth and failing to honor the Athenian gods, that is, with impiety. As one follows the defense that Socrates offers, it becomes clear that for Miletus, those two are actually a single claim, that Socrates did not believe in any god and was undermining filial piety toward parents by teaching their sons to follow his lead. Socrates offers several lines of defense, First, he tries to make the point that Miletus never ever before had given serious consideration to issues of the kind involved in the accusation, and thus doesn't even know just what Socrates supposedly teaches. But, like Euthyphro, Miletus insists that he just does know. Seeking further clarification, Socrates asks, "Is it that I teach people to believe in some gods, which implies that I myself believe in gods, or am not a complete atheist, so that I am not guilty on that score, but in different gods from those recognized by the state, so that your accusation rests upon the fact that they are different? Or do you assert that I believe in no gods at all and teach others to do the same?" Miletus, to avoid the implication that he is confusing belief in gods other than those of Athens with belief in no gods at all, replies that it is the latter. And when Socrates claims to believe that the sun and the moon are gods, as is the general belief of all mankind, Miletus assures the jury that Socrates holds that the sun is a stone and the moon a mass of earth, views advanced by the philosopher-scientist Anaxagoras of Clazomenae, a generation earlier, and not Socrates, and he's quick to point that out. Miletus, however, will not backpedal on his accusation that Socrates is a total atheist. Socrates moves on to a different line of defense, offering to demonstrate to the jury that Miletus is contradicting himself in the accusation, for Miletus agrees that no one would believe in supernatural activities unless they also believe in supernatural beings. Since Socrates refuses to abandon the post assigned to him by the god to lead the philosophical life, just as he never abandoned the post assigned to him by the officers during the battles of Potidæa, Amphipolis, and Delium, it must be noted he does believe in supernatural activities and thus also in supernatural beings, namely God. A last argument he makes is to deny that he ever set himself up as a teacher or ever accepted payment for teaching anyone anything. All he's done is to probe other people's claims to have knowledge of important matters, while many have enjoyed spending a great deal of time in his company. He points out several men, such as Crito, Lysanias, and Antiphon, who were present, as well as others who can testify about whether their sons were corrupted from listening to him. Surely most people today would find that Socrates had amply demonstrated that the charges against him were false, and yet he was condemned. Surely that cannot be simply because he refused to make a pathetic appeal to pity from the jurors. Were they simply incensed at his questioning of their values? Did they think they were being mocked when he famously told them to let no day pass without discussing goodness and all the other subjects about which you hear me talking and examining both myself and others is really the very best thing that a man can do, and that life without this sort of examination is not worth living? Did they actually believe that he was an atheist trying to lead the young of Athens into atheism, that he was truly impious? Should he have argued differently? It turns out there is something in play that may be overlooked by today's readers simply because some of the historical background isn't provided by Plato. Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein, in her work Plato at the Googleplex, Why Philosophy Won't Go Away, in a chapter entitled Socrates Must Die, presents that needed information. It was because of the number of military triumphs in previous times that the Athenians came to view arete, which means the good or excellent, as describing what they regarded as Athenian exceptionalism. This was also conjoined in their ideology with kleos, good report or glory. The combination meant that to live a good life, a life worth living, to deserve a good report, was seen as simply carrying out one's civic duties as an Athenian. Goldstein explains, the ideology of Athenian hegemony intensified the politicizing of arete. To live a life worth living was to do one's civic duty to the city's gods. The religious questions, too, were bound up with the political, melded together in the tacit normative assumptions constituting the lives deemed best. But even were religious and civic duties not bound up with one another, would it be any wonder that he would be charged with impiety? Impiety signals the deepest of normative disturbances, and that is precisely what he aimed to provoke with his normative impudence. In our era of religious intolerance, we might miss the implication of the fact that the charge of impiety was prosecuted in the very same court that judged accusations of murder. Hence, also the importance of the charge that Euthyphro was lodging against his father before that same court where Socrates was tried. For the Athenians, murder and impiety were legally on a par. To destroy a life or to destroy a religious belief, each attacked the very fabric of the city's exceptional existence. To see then that the kinds of questions that Socrates debated and discussed with honorable men of Athens were nearly incomprehensible to them, since he was trying to pry arete away from its encasement in the politics of Athenian exceptionalism. Also, that too remains opaque to us. Goldstein points out that his success in doing just that is reflected in the very fact that now we habitually translate arete as virtue, and no longer as Athenian civic excellence or some equivalent phrase. Socrates has convinced us that virtue might just be something necessary for, but not identical with, a life worth living, and definitely that virtue is something of value to all people, not just to Athenians. The heart of the question, then, was framed for the jurors by Meletus' accusation that made specific the widespread discomfort that Socrates caused by questioning their way of life, their identity as Athenians, their piety itself. So the central point of argument in apology concerned piety towards God or gods and parents or family, and of course, the city-state. The bone of contention was the different conceptions of piety, that of the Athenians versus that of Socrates. In Crito, he broadens the scope of the discussion to include the laws and the state. And we can then see more clearly why he does so. His old friend Crito, on behalf of a group of mutual friends, urges him to let them help him escape the death sentence by fleeing to another country. The main portion of that argument runs for a very long portion of the dialogue. I'm going to try to simplify it for you. He begins by convincing Crito that one may never willingly do wrong, even if somebody wronged us. Then that one must never knowingly cause injury, which is a form of doing wrong, even in retaliation for an injury. Having established that, he raises the question, ought one to fulfill all one's agreements, provided they are right, or should one break them? That opens the path for pointing out that trying to escape Athens after she is condemned to death would be a matter of breaking an agreement with the Constitution, the laws, the state. And here too, he goes on to create a dialogue with the laws which keep questioning him. And here is the interesting way it begins. Come now, what charge do you bring against us and the state that you're trying to destroy us? Did we not give you life in the first place? Was it not through us that your father married your mother and begot you? Tell us, have you any complaint against those of us laws that deal with marriage? No, he says, none. The laws continue to make further points along the same line, insisting that violence is a sin even against your parents, and it is a far greater sin against your country. The laws would offer a dissatisfied citizen the option for leaving the country, but Socrates has never even traveled to another country country, let alone inquired about other constitutions. So he must be satisfied, for he has even begotten children here himself, thereby undertaking in deed, if not in word, to live his life in obedience to us. Socrates would even picture the laws telling him that if he tries to leave, he would be demonstrating that the jurors were right to condemn him, since someone who would destroy the laws and the state might very well be supposed to have a destructive influence upon young and foolish human beings. After that extended imaginary converse with the laws, Crito is finally convinced that it would be wrong for Socrates to flee the city-state. The importance of the argument is that Socrates has made the case that he and all citizens by implication owe filial piety to the state, just as much as to the gods and to the family, including the ancestors. For Socrates, such a destructive action on his part would give the lie to all he had sought to accomplish in clarifying the meaning of goodness, justice, and so forth. He would rather die as the result of an unjust condemnation by his fellow countrymen than turn his back on the demands of piety. In our hyper-individualist time, it might seem odd that the argument could turn on the notion that the laws of the state are the progenitors of its citizens. Self-made men are just barely able to recognize a debt of gratitude, let alone filial piety to their parents. Widening the scope to include one's whole country is a real stretch of the imagination. And God, of course, who is supposed to be in his heaven ignoring what we do on earth, is really out of the picture in an age of practical atheism, as Pope St. John Paul II called it. I turn now to Thomas Aquinas on Pietas. It turns out that even though Aristotle did not offer an explicit development in his thought on piety, an argument can be made that his thought actually can be shown to accommodate such a virtue when construed along the lines of St. Thomas's presentation. Matthew T. Wu presents that case in an article entitled, "Is Piety a Natural Virtue?" In accord with the structure of Aristotle's description of other moral virtues, piety can be described as follows. We can borrow Aristotle's language describing courage to offer something like the following. The pious person reverences what one ought, God, parents, country, that is, one's principles of being, for the reason one ought, that is, a recognition of one's dependency, and acts toward them proportionately in accordance with their worth, that is, worships them appropriately in accordance with their own relative ontological priority. Professor Wu has drawn heavily upon St. Thomas's account of piety in the Summa Theologiae, Prima Secundae, question 101, which relies, interestingly, not on Aristotle, who never talks about it, but on a citation from Cicero's Rhetoric, Book 2. Piety is that by which benevolent duty and loving reverence is offered to parents and country. Cicero qualifies the reverence required as loving, diligens in Latin, the highest kind of love, not merely the love of friendship, amor, just as we saw earlier in his discussion in the Laws. The influence of Cicero throughout Aquinas' treatment of moral virtues is not surprising, by the way, since many medieval thinkers regarded Cicero as a sort of pre-Christian saint. The way Aquinas approaches the topic of piety is important for the modern reader to understand. Piety is treated in that portion of the Secunda Secundae concerned with the cardinal virtue of justice, which begins with questions about the nature of justice and injustice, law, then moves on to kinds of justice, commutative and distributive. Next, he opens a series of discussions of the potential parts of justice, adjunct virtues, the first of which is religion and its many aspects. It's in question 101 that he presents piety, showing first that piety is about what is owed to someone on the grounds either of the person's worth or excellence or because of some benefit received from them. On either ground, God would stand first as the most excellent being of all, and is the ultimate source of all other beings and their governance. So each and every other being owes God reverence, cultus in Latin, which belongs to religion. But, he says, the second-ranking sources of our being and governance are our parents and homeland, from whom and from which we have been born and nourished. And therefore, after God, a person is especially in debt to parents and homeland. Hence, just as it pertains to religion to display reverence toward God, so also, at the second level, it belongs to piety to show reverence to parents and homeland. Reverence for parents includes reverence for all one's blood relatives, because they're called blood relatives since they proceed from the very same parents, as is shown by the philosopher, Aristotle, in the Ethics, chapter 12, before the middle. In reverence for the homeland, reverence for all our fellow citizens and all friends of our homeland is to be understood. Notice particularly how in this passage Aquinas extends the duty of piety beyond one's parents to include the entire extended family, beyond the homeland, which he does not regard simply as a physical place as such, but rather as all its citizens, and even to friends of the homeland. Piety, love towards one's country on this account, is not at all an attitude or even a feeling about some abstract idea or project, but the proper manner of treating real flesh and blood people with whom one shares life, whether by blood or physical connection. In the second article, Aquinas points out two kinds of grounds on which one might owe something. The first ground is the natural connection between father and child, or parent and child. As parent, the person is superior to the child as the very source of the child's being, and consequently, the child owes the parent reverence, cultus, and deference, obsequium. Secondly, one might owe something due to incidental circumstances that happen to befall the parent, such as an unexpected illness or sudden penury. For Aquinas, these sorts of situations should be seen as falling under the obligation of deference or honor, if that term seems more helpful. But it is a matter of subordinate responsibility rather than the primary role of filial piety. That is, the parent has a primary responsibility to support the child to adulthood and save for the future. Thomas says that in so many words. The offspring might need to support the parent in a circumstance of immediate need, but it is not the child's responsibility to save for the parent's future. He says that explicitly too. In this article, there is regrettably little development on the application of the principle to the homeland. The third objection had suggested that there is no responsibility at all to support all one's relatives or fellow citizens. But Aquinas replies briefly, again referring to a passage from Cicero's De Inventione, asserting that one does owe all of them support. However, he says, not to all equally, but especially to parents, to others according to one's means, and to people's integrity. By the way, I've interpreted the word there as integrity. Status doesn't do the job. There are other possibilities, but I think that comes closest. We're talking about the honor due to someone from their character. We may pass over the other two articles, since the third is concerned with demonstrating the piety as a natural moral virtue in its own right, not merely a part of some other virtue such as religion, while the fourth looks into a doubt raised about whether duties of religion take precedence over those to parents. Though in the third article, Aquinas does recall that the basis for the duties of piety to parents and homeland are grounded on the person's dependence on them as sources of being and governance, there's no allusion to the patria at all in the fourth. That's unfortunate, I think. But what our reading of Aquinas' discussion of piety, together with Wu's analysis of it in search of an Augustinian formulation of it, brings to light is that the duty of piety is grounded radically in the recognition of our contingency, that is, our triple dependence on God, parents, and patria for our very existence. From that recognition flows the display of reverence and deference to each in special forms of love for each. The duty of love of country, amor patriae, is one of those forms of love which for Aquinas produces a devotion to our fellow citizens that affirms and promotes their good, both material and spiritual, just as filial piety toward our parents and families affirms and promotes their good as well, first and foremost. The relationship is not contingent upon an agreement or contract that we may choose to make, in other words, loyalty. Rather, it is an ontic relationship in which we exist prior to any choices or agreements we enact, a relationship which we experience intimately in the family, whether we reflect upon it or not, which provides us the platform for all the choices and agreements we eventually make. When we begin to reflect on the relationships we have with those beyond the family relationships with fellow citizens, and even simply others who happen to support or admire our country, it is only natural for us to comprehend them as an enlargement of the original sphere of familial relations of loving concern. Such is the Thomist understanding of amor patriae, love of country, patriotism as piety. I come finally to the conclusion. In Stephen Smith's presentation of patriotism as loyalty, we discovered an analysis of the development of a particularly American understanding rooted mainly in Enlightenment thought and its specific attachments of a small number of American thinkers. We also saw that the identification of patriotism with loyalty is also found in the early thought of Alistair MacIntyre and some others who have responded to him. We also saw the kinds of quandaries that viewing patriotism through the lens of loyalty can lead to, particularly an exclusivity that can drive a wedge between people of different countries, even leading to a view that only citizens of our country, whichever it might be, can be patriotic, with the consequence that citizens of other countries must not be patriotic, or, if we admit they might be, their loyalty must inevitably be opposed to ours, thereby setting the scene for rancor that might escalate to conflict. Think of what's going on these days in Russia and the United States. Some efforts have been advanced to avoid these negative results by offering a weakened form of loyalty that has some cosmopolitan elements, but these either lead away from the loyalty model or simply undercut the very possibility of patriotism. The problems with patriotism were noted by Adam Smith already, even though he did not identify it with loyalty. In any case, these sorts of issues have led many, especially those of the cosmopolitan bent, to reject the very notion of patriotism as a possible virtue. It's against this background that Stephen Smith advances his concept of enlightened patriotism in the interest of avoiding at least the most resistant problems. Since his position has been amply expounded earlier, we're not going to repeat the elements that we noted there, or the difficulties that remain even if one adopts his position. The reason for returning to older visions of patriotism was to explore the possibility that an alternative might be available to the view proposed by Stephen Smith. Returning all the way to Plato, we saw that the accusation, trial, and eventual execution of Socrates was framed in terms of piety towards the gods, the family, and the city-state. Socrates' behavior and ideas were experienced by the Athenians as so far out of line with their self-identity as to exclude him from their society. He was viewed in our terms as unpatriotic. His love for his homeland was, in their eyes, dubious at best, and more likely, totally absent. He could not be allowed to live among them. The Athenian exceptionalism was at odds with Socrates' understanding of piety. Coincidentally, we also note that Aristotle similarly held a non-Athenian understanding of piety and so avoided that topic in his writings. From Cicero, we learned of an interesting possibility of avoiding the exclusivist notion of patriotism when he asserted that a person could have more than one patria without suffering from any necessary conflict of interest, though one might place one patria above the other. Again, Cicero discussed the love of country in terms of piety. Moving on to the Middle Ages, we find in Thomas Aquinas' examination of piety another instance of the understanding of love of country embedded within the framework of the virtue of piety, which would make love of country a moral duty. And that duty arises for him from within the life of the family and extends outward to embrace love of all fellow citizens as well as beyond them, even peoples of other lands. We should note he does not present this idea in terms of Christian universalism as suggested by Smith at one point, but simply in terms of a broad Ciceronian patriotism. The very fact that for centuries when people spoke of what we today call patriotism, they did so through the lens of piety should give us pause before we cast our lot with the enlightened patriotism of Stephen Smith. Piety opens us to others in a loving, affirming way that excludes no person of any land or background, but instead rejects all forms of mistreatment, harm, hatred, indeed any negative action or attitude. Contrary to the exclusiveness implied by the loyalty model, piety can be unabashedly inclusive. It is not a theoretical cosmopolitanism. Piety is a practical virtue that has no need for the imaginary borders of modern nation-states. Piety grows from an existential awareness of our contingency, our fragility, our dependence, indeed our interdependence. Even if one happens not to believe there is a God on whom we depend, we all recognize that none of us would be here at all had we not been born to parents. And even if some of us experienced a difficult childhood that might make us less than comfortable with the notion of filial piety, we can nevertheless acknowledge our radical dependence on them for our very existence. The interdependence of our upbringing, our education, our earliest experience of friendship, and even rivalry reveal to us bonds without which we could not be who we are. It is in honoring all those people whom we can recall, whom we can call by name, that we discover the meaning of piety. And so we see why, at the beginning of this lecture, I said, patriotism begins at home. From there, we can extend our sense of connection and responsibility to the level that we name patriotism, a love and devotion for all our fellow citizens. Not a commitment to a set of abstract ideas, nor to a constitution, nor to a governmental system, but a devotion to real, living, breathing human beings upon whom we depend and who in turn depend upon us. Such piety is patriotism, a duty and a virtue. It is a particular form of love that surpasses the minimum of mere justice to promote the health, the safety, the thriving of all our fellow citizens in our local communities, but also beyond. It is not an attachment to an ideology, a political party, any kind of movement, but a habit of the heart that does not weary of seeking to do all the good we can for all our companions in the adventure of life. To them, and not to abstractions, we mutually pledge to each other and our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Yet such a pledge enjoins not individualistic independence, but rather a dynamic interdependence, a mutual solidarity. Therein lies piety. Therein lives patriotism. Thank you. So at this point, I'm going to move on to look at some questions. And as I said, if anyone has a question that they would like to ask, you can raise your hand and someone will bring you a card to write it on. and I will eventually try to answer it. So let me begin with questions coming from our philosophy majors. The first question is a simple one. What was your inspiration for this talk? And it's simply the kind of fracture in the society that we live in today, the constant competition to claim patriotism. People trying to create a patriot party or something of that kind without telling us what they mean by the word. And I suspect they would not agree with what I said about piety. So that is what gave the birth to that idea. I can tell you that when I was originally talking about possible ideas, that Dr. Sharon suggested something different, and I may honor her preference next year. That is the concept of the common good. I say may because I'm just getting started in my research on that. But that's how I came to talk about patriotism. Another question, is it possible to be patriotic in an impious state? I would want to say it is, because, as you heard me say toward the end, patriotism is not to the state as such, but to the people who live there. It is to all the people who live there who may deeply suffer from the impiety of the state itself. So I think the answer is yes, you can find yourself in an impious state for any number of different reasons and still be pious yourself, still be a true patriot, not because you are committed to the way a government operates, for example, but because you are connected to all those people and you want to support, protect, and help them to thrive. That is what patriotism is radically about. Can it be patriotic to leave an impious state? If we were to look only at the example of Socrates, we might think that the answer would have to be no. I'm not quite as rigorous as Socrates was, and so I do believe that there can be very good reasons why one would leave an impious state. For example, the state might engage in activities which are so morally objectionable that I cannot live there without being seen as contributing to and approving of those activities. I can therefore, in order to disengage myself, in order not to be complicit in the evil of others, I can choose to leave the state and still be patriotic, because I can still continue to want all the best for the people of that state, though they may be sorely oppressed by the state. Another question. Can you be considered a patriot even if you don't like something about your country, even something significant? Is it essential to be critical of your country? Yes, you can be a patriot even if you don't like something about your country. Again, it comes back to the difference between the society and the state, which I do think is a valid distinction. We can love all the members of the society and despise the way the state is structured, the way it operates, the principles on which it makes laws, and so forth. That is certainly very possible. What I want to mention here, and by the way, I have the book with me, I'll pull it up shortly, but just in case anybody wants to look at the book that I'm referencing from Stephen Smith. There's a famous expression that was very widely heard back during the Vietnam War, "My country, right or wrong." That phrase was originally pronounced by a man named Stephen Decatur as an after-dinner toast to the former general, Senator Karl Schurz, a German refugee who had survived the 1848 revolution and had come to the United States and was a general in the Civil War. And he was accused in the Senate of not being patriotic enough by people like Decatur. And he answered, making it his own. "My country, right or wrong? If right, to be kept right. If wrong, to be set right." And I think that is a profoundly patriotic outlook. It's not a matter of just tolerating what you find objectionable. It is a matter of setting right what is wrong. So yes, I think we can do that with something very significant. Is it essential to be critical of your country? Again, I would say that the answer is clearly yes, because in order to love my neighbor as myself, to love with piety, I must always be alert to any way in which the society, or the state especially, is headed that might do harm, that might undermine the lives of those people. So yes, one can definitely be critical of one's country, and one ought. I would say that too is part of authentic patriotism. Doesn't location have moral significance on strength of obligation? For example, Americans owe more to their neighboring Kentuckians than Alaskans, though other U.S. citizens, etc. But what about non-citizens? Before those who belong to another country? Yes, and there again, that is the point that both Cicero makes and Aquinas in talking about a kind of decreasing level of responsibility as you move further away from the center, from your own home, your own patria, out to wider and wider circles. That doesn't mean we should ignore the needs of others. It does mean simply that we have to acknowledge our own limitations and be willing to say those needs of those other people have to be met by larger circles of people than just me. I can be firmly convinced that I ought to help with that, but I can't assume that I must be the only one who takes up a burden. There are others who will join in doing that. Is the location itself an object of care or duty, in contrast to having an obligation to the people who live there? Well, I want to put the first importance on the people who live there, for certain. I do think, though, that for the same kinds of reasons that Cicero gave regarding his two patriae, that the location is important also. That we have a duty to care about and to care for the place where we originate. We may move to many different places in the course of our life, and therefore acquire interests and concerns in many different places. But we come back, as Cicero says, to that place from which we came. That place is important. And so when he took his friends to his birthplace, he was honoring that idea and offering, I think, a special indication to all of us to take that seriously. I have to admit, I only occasionally go back to Southgate, but I have to say that when I go back there, I have feelings of attachment that I cannot deny. I'm not going to go over and sweep the streets. But on the other hand, I do care. When I drive down a street, for example, and see the house in which I lived when I was a small child falling into disrepair, that tugs at my heart. That's normal. That's the way it should be. And that is, if you will, a kind of indication of what that piety is about that we call patriotism. That happens that way. Yeah. Let's see. One more question here. Yes. In what way can we develop piety in order to improve our practice of this sense of patriotism? Oh my. Well, as with any other virtue, it's important to practice. And so that is the key word. And not to practice indiscriminately, but attentively. So I would come back to pointing up those different circles of piety. Family, extended family, neighbors, people in the immediate community, and so on. And ask, how can I, just as a matter of course, see all of those people with compassion? Treat all of them with kindness. Consider what their needs are, their difficulties. All of those kinds of questions that I can ask myself, again, in expanding circles. If I keep asking myself those questions, and then asking myself, not just a theoretical question, but is there something I can do to respond to that? Then I am practicing piety. I am practicing patriotism. It's a matter of making it concrete with real people. Again, as I said earlier, it's not about abstractions. It's not about humanity with a capital H. It's about real, live human beings. This is the key to everything. I am going to stop here because I actually looked at the clock and realized it's nearly 9 o'clock. And I think that probably this is as much as all of us can endure. There are some refreshments in the back for anyone
Thanks again to the Zieglers for the very generous gift. I did want to announce also that there are other event actually on a similar theme. So after we have read tonight Monsignor Gerald E, if you still can't sleep, there are some papers by Patrick and me, exercises coming